Here we go. All right, my friends. And today, I believe we are going to finish Mark's gospel. Although, if I say that out loud, we probably won't. But I think it's within our reach. Here we go. And for our opening prayer this morning, I've chosen this from Richard Rohr. It feels appropriate given our desire to connect with our brothers and sisters who are in so much pain and suffering in Ukraine. Let us pray. O God, Lord of all creation, lover of life and of everything, please help us to love in our very small way what you love infinitely and everywhere. We thank you that we can offer just this one prayer, and that will be more than enough. Because in reality, everything and everyone is connected, and nothing stands alone. To pray for one part is really to pray for the whole, and so we do. Help us each day to stand for love, for healing, for the good, for the diverse unity of the body of Christ and all creation. Because we know this is what you desire, as Jesus prayed that all may be one. We offer our prayer together with all the holy names of God. We offer our prayer together with Christ, our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
All right. So this morning we're going to read the last chapter of Mark's Gospel, which is controversial. And if you're not familiar with it, you'll see why shortly. But I wanted to begin by reminding us of this painting we looked at before from Giotto, The Arrest of Christ, back in when we were talking about chapter 14. Um, and do you remember what it was about this painting that caused me to bring it to our attention?
All the weapons.
The weapons, yeah.
Um,
What's going on over here on the left side of the painting?
the fleeing young man.
Yeah, the fleeing young man. Do you remember about him? It's one of those odd moments in Mark where there's this. Do you remember what happened? The young man was there at the arrest, and what happened to him as he ran away?
Lost his clothing. I mean, he didn't have his clothing. He didn't have any clothing.
The streaker. So there, and we had an extended conversation about who this guy was. Is this Mark himself making a cameo? Some scholars have thought that, and some of us thought that. Others have talked about maybe he's representative of the disciples and their failure to be constant, to abide with Jesus. Maybe it's meant to be us, stripped away of everything. So I call us back to that moment because we had a lot of questions about who he was, and there are questions about who he might be as we go forward as well. So, with that said, let's take a look at chapter 16. Now, the reason that the end of Mark's gospel is controversial, or at least potentially confusing, is that you'll see that it's listed here that there's a shorter ending of Mark and a longer ending of Mark. And scholars are divided, as scholars always are, about where the gospel actually originally ended. And my buddy N.T. Wright, who's been accompanying us through our study of Mark, says that he's convinced that the actual ending of Mark's gospel got lost somewhere, which may be true. It doesn't solve our problem. But as we go forward, we'll read the shorter ending and we'll talk about that. And then we'll read the longer ending. And then we'll decide what we think. So, with all of that said, would somebody like to read 1 through 9, including this shorter ending of Mark?
I'll do it.
Thanks, Ray.
When the 1 through 9, when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see it, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Is that okay? And this next paragraph also.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And all that had been commanded them, they told briefly to those around Peter. And afterward, Jesus himself sent out through them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation.
Thank you. There actually are three possibilities. The first possibility is that the gospel ends there at verse 7 with saying nothing to anyone and them being afraid. Then there's that additional paragraph that Ray just read, and then there's the longer ending that we'll read in a minute. So this is why it gets confusing. What do you hear or notice here? Obviously, this is a very familiar story to us, but we always are called to listen to what each gospeler says and how he paints the picture.
Because of our conversation just 2 minutes prior, one of the things that hit me was the young man dressed in white.
Mm-hmm.
Another mystery man.
Another mystery man. Yes. And I'll just say this about that. So here are the verses that, I can do this so you can see it better. Come on. Okay. So from 14, at the arrest of Jesus, a certain young man was following Jesus, wearing nothing but a linen cloth. They cut hold of him, but he left the linen cloth and ran off naked. And then we just heard, as they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. Now, we might not think a whole lot about that. The phrase young man isn't that unusual, except that it's not used that often in the New Testament. And in Mark, it's only used in those two spots. So it just makes you wonder, makes me wonder. I don't know if it makes you wonder as well, but it makes me wonder if there is some connection between the naked young guy running off and this now dressed in white guy in the empty tomb.
I was peeking at the definition and it looked like I usually used of a surrogate.
Yes, I'm sorry, I clicked off of that too quickly. Absolutely. Yep, a young man, youth used of a young attendant or servant. Yes. Neoniskos.
What do angels appear usually in white? Or could we talk about how angels have appeared?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
I believe angels ministered to him in the desert.
Mm-hmm.
But they weren't wearing white.
Well, it's not specified, I don't think.
Mm-hmm.
In the gospel parallels, Matthew calls them angels, or the guy who's there is an angel. In
Mm-hmm.
Luke, it is two men but they are in dazzling white,
Yeah.
not just in a white robe.
Mhm.
So you figure.
Hmm.
It's kind of like as the story was retold, the women retold it this way. This is what we saw, very, very grounded. And then things get clarified. They realize that it was an apparition or something spiritual. Now it's an angel, and why? Yeah, there were two of them, and they were not only white, but dazzling.
Yeah.
There's a term for that that's used that I read in connection with people who have post-death experiences and then come back and
Yeah.
tell what it is. And every time they tell it, they remember something more because of the questions that people are asking them. And it's an inflated memory that accretes detail from the retelling of it and the audience of the retelling. So that could be what happened to this story. You know, it's a boy and then it's two angels.
Mm-hmm.
I apologize. Let me add one more thing from Matthew, because not only does he call it an angel, but it's an angel who descends from heaven, comes and rolls back the stone. He's like lightning, and his raiment is white as snow, and the guards and everybody tremble and fear like dead men.
There's a lot going on in Matthew.
So
that we don't have.
so Matthew really makes a dramatic entrance, while Luke and Mark talk about men, just young men, although Luke makes them dazzling white.
It's kind of amazing that if you take Mark as the original story, that it isn't resurrection enough without embroidery.
Everybody's got to add a fanfare.
Yeah, well.
And it does, Mark leaves the question open as to who rolled the stone away. Maybe it's this young man in his white robe. We don't know.
I don't know.
I love to think about, I know that when we first encountered the naked young man in chapter 14, I remember Fred asked the question, is this a Markan sandwich? And to my mind, this kind of could be considered a Markan sandwich, a big one, because there's a lot of meat between the arrest and the resurrection. But this idea and the fact that, again, Mark is so sparse with some of his details. So the fact that he includes the young man again, it makes me wonder, is this meant to be symbolic of, restitution or reconciliation, or the one who had gone astray and run away now is a witness to the resurrection? Because of course there are no witnesses to the resurrection, but this young man sitting in the empty tomb, you might think, did he witness the resurrection? Of course, being Mark, it raises more questions than answers always. But I like to think that there might be some connection. To me, it makes sense given the way Mark has drafted the whole story. So who is here and who isn't here?
I'm sorry, Patty, I didn't hear that.
Who is here in this scene and who isn't here?
We have three women and a young man.
And none of the other disciples.
Three women or two women?
Mary Magdalene, Mary, mother of James, and Salome.
Oh, and okay. I always got confused if it was Mary, the mother of James, and Salome.
Yeah, that's a good question.
The comma makes a difference in this reading, but it might not. You might be exactly right.
This is why I love the Oxford comma.
He also mentioned the two Marys and Salome earlier.
Yes.
Because we were speculating whether that might be Herod's Salome.
Exactly.
Well, who's not there is none of the disciples.
Yeah. But when is oh, go ahead, Ellie. I'm sorry.
This could be a tougher digression, but it strikes me that the tomb is very large. If it's got room for 4 people to stand in it, and plus the place where Jesus was laid,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm wondering if that detail is the same. It's Josephus's tomb, so it is that of a it's a very rich accommodation. It's not a columbarium.
Mm-mm.
In terms of, I love the gospel parallels. I apologize. Just
Don't.
No, I love them
It's
too.
so helpful, John. I love that you're reading
in
along.
Matthew, the people identified are Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, who I think earlier was called the mother of James and Salome or whatever. In Luke, it is in general the women who had come with him from Galilee. So with that, could be lots of people.
Mm-hmm. I love that this young man says, go tell his disciples and Peter. So, Peter is somehow isolated from the rest of the disciples. And at the same time, he is identified by name. So what's that about, I wonder?
Don't know.
Well, didn't Jesus already designate Peter that you'll be my rock?
In
I don't remember
Matthew's
where that was.
gospel. In Matthew, but not in Mark.
But he's distinguished him.
He,
He
When-
denied him.
yes.
Yeah.
The last time we saw Peter, right, was the denial in the temple precincts there. And so it's interesting that he is specifically named. So it's, he is not just cut off into outer darkness, just ignored. Not only is he told, but he is specifically told. So
Included.
yeah, he's included. And I personally, I love that because again, it gives me hope. But yeah, that Mark goes out of his way to identify Peter.
Also picks up a thread in the story. The last time we saw Peter, he was at those denials.
Mm-hmm.
And then that leaves open the question of whether he continued to be one of the disciples, having forsworn.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Whether he was still part of the physical group.
Yep.
Yeah, but this would say he's still part of the team, even though we know about the denials.
Yep. Exactly.
That's forgiven. That's forgiven.
Exactly.
My book that I'm reading from ends right at the say nothing to anyone for they were afraid. It doesn't have the shorter ending after it. And when I read that, I said, go tell the disciples, tell Peter what's happening. But then when I got to the end of it, it says, oh, they were afraid and they didn't tell anyone. And so I was, which didn't make much sense. I was very confused. So actually the shorter ending helps me understand that, yes, they did go as they were commanded. And that not saying anything to anyone, I guess, presumably is then nobody on the way to meeting the disciples.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I really like the long ending because it seems so human and of what they would do, what the women would do. It would have been something that would practically frighten anybody to death, and but they don't die. But it seems that the other ending is a tack on it, and almost to explain to the reader, okay, reader, well, that people found out about it, so here's how they found out about it. Plus, Jesus spread the word through them.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like that second part is some sort of a part that's given to people who are very needy and very wanting of every single I dotted and just aren't able to accept this very human ending at this point.
It's like fanfic.
Well, why don't we read the longer ending? Then we can really get into what we think. Would someone mind reading all of this 9 through 20? Because even though this is chopped up into paragraphs, I think it'll read fast.
Oh, all right.
Thank you. No pressure.
Okay. And this is continuing from they were, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid.
Yep.
Now, after Jesus rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out seven demons. She went out and told those who had been with him while they were mourning and weeping. But when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they would not believe it. After this, he appeared in another form to two of them as they were walking into the country. And they went back and told the rest, but they didn't believe them. Later, he appeared to the 11 themselves as they were sitting at the table. And he upbraided them for their lack of faith and stubbornness, because they had not believed those who saw him after he had risen. And he said to them, "Go into all the world and proclaim the good news to the whole creation. The one who believes and is baptized will be saved, but the one who does not believe will be condemned. And these signs will accompany those who believe. By using my name, they will cast out demons. They will speak in new tongues. They will pick up snakes in their hands. And if they drink any deadly thing, it will not hurt them. They will lay their hands on the sick, and they will recover." So then the Lord Jesus, after he had spoken to them, was taken up into heaven and sat down at the right hand of God. And they went out and proclaimed the good news everywhere, while the Lord worked with them and confirmed the message by the signs that accompanied it.
Thank you, Ellie. So I think it's important, really important for us to look at the footnotes. So we'll do that, and then we can dig into wherever you think the gospel really ends. So first of all, some of the most ancient authorities bring the book to a close at the end of verse 8, and that's where they said nothing to anyone and were afraid. One authority concludes the book with a shorter ending, which is here where we read. You notice this verse doesn't have a number. It's weird. All that had been commanded them told briefly to those around Peter. So, and then others include, and then continue with verses 9 through 20. In most authorities, verses 9 through 20 follow immediately after verse 8. Though in some of these authorities, the passage is marked as being doubtful. Got that, everybody? And then there's also another possible verse that is meant to go after the upbraiding, which is, other ancient authorities add, in whole or in part. They excuse themselves, saying this age of lawlessness and unbelief is under Satan, who does not allow the truth and power of God to prevail over the unclean things of the Spirit. Therefore, reveal your righteousness now. Thus they spoke to Christ, and Christ replied to them, "The term of years of Satan's power has been fulfilled, but other terrible things draw near. And for those who have sinned, I was handed over to death, that they may return to the truth and sin no more, that they may inherit the spiritual and imperishable glory of righteousness that is in heaven." Does that sound like Mark to you?
No, doesn't sound like Jesus either.
No, not at all. We've been, walking with Mark. This is now week 29 of our Mark in Bible study. And so we have a lot of experience of Mark, right? We've spent half a year on him, and more than half a year. And I think we're all positioned to say that does not sound like Mark at all. So,
Come to think of it, the whole list of all the things that all the evangelist talent list, it doesn't sound like him either.
Which one Ellie is at?
starting, can you move it down a little bit, Patty? Starting with a there, and these signs will accompany those who believe. It's kind of a
Snake.
little skills checklist.
Yeah. Yeah, this is the origin apparently for those who believe in snake handling. Um, so I leave
Yeah.
that there.
Remember the Garrison Keillor quip about a town so small that even the Episcopalians are handling snakes?
That sounds like Garrison.
Yeah.
Doesn't sound like Mark, but it sounds like Garrison. John, what were you going to say?
Well, again, because I've got the parallels here. The Mark ending, they've got some footnotes on it, and
Mhm.
much of what it is at the 14 through the end is summaries of things that appear in Matthew and in Luke.
Yes.
So you could have somebody, who's now got all three gospels saying, oh, gee, Mark ended it right there. We need to put in the guys
Mhm.
walking in the country. That's the road to Emmaus. We need to put in
Yeah.
the ascension. That's, somebody else, and other
Mhm.
ones. So it seemed like again, a short summary of key points from the other ending narratives.
Absolutely. And even verses 9 through 11 here appearing first to Mary Magdalene. Think about when we read the Gospel of John, right? And Mary Magdalene encounters him in the garden and thinks he's the gardener. That sounds like John. And it's
Oh.
weird because here it's, verse 9 says, after he rose early in the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene. And it describes her as the one from whom he'd cast out 7 demons, but Mary's already been mentioned at verse 1. So again, it sounds, it's a strange editorial blip, because we've just been talking about Mary Magdalene coming to the tomb with the other Mary and Salome.
Patty, did you want to hear what Amy Joe
Yes,
Levine?
please.
Yes.
Okay, she says this was not likely the original ending of Mark. Most scholars assume that it is a second century pastiche of phrases from the other gospels. For centuries, it was accepted as the authentic conclusion of the gospel and was included in the King James Version until recently the most widely used English translation. It provides a scriptural basis for groups who practice snake handling and drinking poison while in the spirit.
Thank you.
I would speak up for ending it at the shortest version, right at the end of
Right there, where they were
yeah.
afraid.
And the reason is this: I have in my head now. You gave us that video of the reading of Mark's gospel by a professional storyteller, and he read it exactly, but leaving it hanging here, it's kind of, to me, it says a couple things. One is, what are you doing now? This is what you were given. Where have we gone since then? Where, you finished the story. This is your assignment. And I think, by leaving it open, by adding anything to that, it cuts off the story and cauterizes the open end. And I just personally like the open end.
I love the
May
way.
not be as-
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I love the way you said that about cauterizing the open end, because isn't that human nature that we don't, it's so uncomfortable to leave it there. And obviously they said something to somebody because 2,000 years later, here we are. But the fact that the story is left hanging there, I have to say, I'm with you, Ray. I prefer ending it right at verse 8 too. Because it kind of fits with what we know about the disciples. And,
Yeah.
How many times did Jesus tell them, and how many times did they fail to understand and not stay awake, and all of that we've been talking about?
And I guess I haven't got a fine thought on this, but I would say, this is one, the edition is one set of endings. I mean, I think in fact what happened was this story was taken out and retold
Mhm.
before these endings were put on, and people gave it other endings. And since then, we have done this. Since then, Thomas
Mhm.
went to India and told it. Since then, Stephen encountered the Queen's eunuch. There's much more to be said. And then they just, out of all of that, just narrowed it down to this chunk, which is fine,
Mhm.
but it isn't the whole thing. It doesn't have the potential and the strength of a more varied ending, the open end.
I wanted to share with you something that N.T. Wright said, because I think this actually ties in beautifully with what you were just saying, Ray.
Oh, geez.
I
Am I on
know.
the same frequency?
Yes. There is a blank at the end of the story, and we are invited to fill it for ourselves. Do we take Easter for granted, or have we found ourselves awestruck at the strange new work of God? What do we know of the risen Lord? Where is he now going ahead of us? What tasks has he for us to undertake today to take the gospel of the kingdom to the ends of the earth?
Thank you, Nate. Great.
Yeah. And it's the same thing that you're saying. It's like the write your own adventure. It's like it's purposely hanging there. And I mean, and not obviously not everyone likes that, and not everyone thinks that that's actually where the gospel ends. But I think it kind of fits with the rest of Mark to end it there.
I agree. Stories, when you think about them, stories just never end. I mean, there's always the happily ever after, but yeah, what happens then? And in real life, somebody did something the next day. It's like Edith Funker say, and 10 minutes later. Um, so I think Ray's right. I think just cut it off and then let you and your God work out for yourself what happened then and 10 minutes later and
Mm-hmm.
I
200
do
years
think
later.
I think that in the addenda there's some wonderful stuff, and he appeared to them in different forms. He did
Mm-hmm.
not look like himself. He did like the physical form that they knew. To me, that's both mysterious and empowering.
Mm-hmm.
Just keep your eyes open. Watch who you're looking at.
Mhm.
Pay attention.
Exactly. And to John's point, verses 12 and 13, that he appeared in another form to two of them as they were walking into the country, road to
Yeah,
Emmaus,
yeah,
very
yeah.
clearly. So, I think we have reason to believe that those instances did happen. Um, the question is, how did Mark originally choose to tell the story? And of course, we'll never know. But the language sounds different to me at this point. So it makes sense in what Donna read from Amy Jo Levine about it being a pastiche of other snippets. That makes perfect sense to me. That, of course, they would go back and kind of try to finish the story using the material that they had learned elsewhere as the story circulated. Because as Ray is always reminding us, rightly, you know, the oral tradition, right? That's how the Gospels were transmitted originally. And it took a long time before they were written down. So we always have to remember that as we think about how the stories took shape, and that it they do continue on. They do have a life of their own. And just when they get written down doesn't mean that the story ends. Is what Ellie was saying too.
Yeah, I guess that's what's irritating about the, I'm going to call them fundamentalists, but the literalists who don't leave that room to breathe. And, if it was said this way, this is exactly the way it happened and nothing more, nothing different. And here we're open. We're lucky. We're open to more possibilities.
Well, to my mind, it just makes sense that there are more than, yeah, that there are more than one possibility. Um, well, hearing all of this and thinking about the material that we have, and maybe we want to focus mostly on this first paragraph if that seems most marking. And I don't want to push that agenda just because that's my view, but yeah. Um,
But it
is
did.
there anything here that surprises you or maybe hadn't noticed before or helps you draw a thread as we end Mark's gospel? I have to say that verse 8, they fled, terror and amazement seized them, which, are right side by side. I just wanted to look at the Greek for a minute, because that kind of feels right to me too, that would be
Yeah.
an understandable response. So the word that gets translated as terror is tromos, trembling. Oh, sorry. Again, not a word that's used very often. If you see, it's only used 5 times in the New Testament. Mark is the only one who uses it in the Gospels. Fear and trembling used to describe the anxiety of one who distrusts his ability completely to meet all requirements. Um, and then astonishment, ecstasis, of course, the root from which we get ecstasy. Um, a throwing of the mind out of its normal state, alienation of mind. Um, I love that because that prefix ek is throw. So it's just like everything is up for grabs at that point.
Blew their mind.
And that, yeah, blew their mind. And it kind of feels that way to me. Terror and amazement, trembling and ecstasy seized them.
When you think of it, it seems logical that they would not go and follow the directions of going to Peter, that they would need time to process all this. That it was, as Ellie said, their minds were blown. They would have to sit and get over their fear, their trembling and shaking, and
Mhm.
exchange information about it. And it's one of those things that happens that you can't do anything else for the rest of the day.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You can imagine the three of them huddling under a tree saying, what was that? And getting everybody's sharing the experience and working it over.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But Donna's right. It would take a while to get over it and process it, try to figure out what it was that actually they saw.
In my version of the shorter ending, which follows there, actually reads a little better in the sense that, they were terror and amazement, they were seized, they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Then this version picks up, but they reported briefly to Peter and those with him all that they had been told. And after this, Jesus himself set out. So it sort of gives that they were afraid. We weren't saying anything. We were talking it over, Ellie, just like you said. But then they went and did what they were supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.
I would think, I mean, if Mary Magdalene was one from whom Jesus had cast out 7 demons, she'd be wondering about her own sanity again.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Good point.
Absolutely. It's this phrase here that doesn't sound like Mark to me, the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That definitely does not sound like Mark. Although I like the idea, as John says, I like the idea that, yeah, they're seized with fear. They take a beat, they stare at each other. What the heck happened? And then they complete their mission. They do what they've been commanded to do. It's just, that language just doesn't sound like him.
Well, Patty, I agree with you. That's not Mark, that last sentence.
Yep.
But golly, if you got to have one sentence to
Yep.
say, fill in the rest of the story, that's a pretty good one.
I agree. And in terms of drawing the thread, right? And that makes sense as we think about the fact that 2,000 years later, here we sit. The story didn't die with Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome. So,
You could put a period after east to west, and it would sound more Markan.
Yep, definitely.
Here's the fact. And
Yep.
and then what follows is the interpretation of what it meant, and that doesn't sound Markan.
And so that's just a good reminder about, the editorial hand that enters in as this was canonized. Yeah.
I'm trying to remember, Patty, did Mark use, haven't rethought, did he have a discussion of salvation and the salvation doctrines and stuff?
No, not really. I mean, it's much more basic in terms of Jesus telling the disciples what will happen and that on the third day he will be raised again. Yeah. So what about N.T. Wright's question? When he says there's a blank at the end. What do we think about this when he says, do we take Easter for granted? And this is a question that's addressed to all of us. Or have we found ourselves awestruck at the strange new work of God? What do we know of the risen Lord? Where is he now going ahead of us? What tasks has he for us to undertake today to take the gospel of the kingdom to the ends of the earth? Does anyone have any thoughts about that? Let's see if I can put it so that we can actually see it.
I personally like it. I mean, I have always had, the resurrection and the Easter and that stuff. There's lots of stuff floating around that's hard, but this brings it, at least to me and to my life and how I go forward.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think it is so easy to take Easter for granted, right? Because our lives have been lived post-resurrection, period, full stop. We've known that part of the end of the story as long as we've known the Christian story. And so it's only, and I'm going back to what you said, Ellie, about the three women, sitting there, and Donna saying this too, that, they would have to, they'd have to spend the day, kind of processing. And I think if we can put ourselves back at that point and really think about what does this mean, because it's so easy to domesticate the resurrection. And I know for myself that I do that all the time. It's like, yes, our God is a God of resurrection. We are an Easter people, and I believe that. But it's so easy to say that and then blip over, the shaking of the foundations that causes that to happen. And what does that really mean? And then what does it mean for us as followers of Jesus today when war rages in Ukraine and when COVID continues to take lives every day? And when we have refugees from Afghanistan flooding into this country and all of that, there is so much. What does Easter mean in that context? And do we still find ourselves awestruck at the strange new work of God? I love the way he asks those questions.
Do you interpret right as meaning that if taking Easter for granted would be that Jesus is resurrected and that there's resurrection or eternal life for everybody? And he's saying, no, you just can't accept that promise. You have Easter or in Jesus's life, and Easter implies that we have work to do in the world.
Mm-hmm. 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 Well, if we believe, that's a great question, Donna. If we believe that the story does continue on, right? That, this isn't just, that the resurrection wasn't just a period at the end of the sentence, that, okay, that happened, and now, just life goes on. If we believe that the risen Christ is active in the world today, now, even as we gather to talk about him, then there is sort of a mandate, right? That we are to continue to do this work in the world. And I just think that it's easy, and I'll speak for myself, just to say, okay, yes, I believe that the resurrection happened, and do I believe that it has ramifications for me today? And that's the part that I think we all, with which I have to wrestle.
Yeah. Ditto.
Yeah.
Well, I will say this, that I have loved studying Mark's gospel with you all. And again, we think, oh, it's the shortest gospel. It shouldn't take us that long to work our way through, but there's so much and it's so rich. And this group brings a tremendous amount to it as we look at the parallels and as we think about the cultural context and as we hear from Amy Jill Levine and all of it. This is absolutely a co-creation that we are all making together. So for that I am very, very grateful. And you've brought a lot out in Mark's gospel that I haven't really, for all the times I've read it, I haven't heard necessarily that way before. And so I learn very much from you all as we go forward.
Could I throw something in, not specifically on Mark, but more specifically on what we're doing? There was a piece in Facebook yesterday that I will try to pull out about the significance of remembering. And the thrust of it was that the act of remembering is not an act of recalling an event, but it in terms of putting the body back together, of actually recreating the time and place in the moment. And it ties into a Eucharistic philosophy that I think we would certainly recognize. I'll try to find that and send it to you if you're interested in it.
Well, that's what Ellie sent us yesterday, right?
Oh, she did. Okay.
Brother,
That
where
was from the
Yes.
SSJ.
Okay, was that where that came from? Thank you,
Yeah.
Ellie.
Yeah, my son-in-law Micah sent me the link to subscribe to their
Brother.
word of the day,
Yeah.
and you can read the short version or you can go online and read the rest of it. But it's just a nice few minutes in the morning to
Yeah.
to
Well,
read
sorry
this.
for not remembering the source. So.
No,
that's okay.
but I'm so glad that you brought that up, and I'm so glad Ellie sent that to us. And if we think about what happens in the Eucharist, when Jesus, or think about that moment when Jesus says, "Do this for the remembrance of me," that remembrance is putting me back together, Jesus says. And that's what happens to all of us in that moment. And in that moment in the Great Thanksgiving and the Eucharistic prayer is called the anamnesis, which is the opposite. If we think about amnesia as forgetting, that is the moment when we are brought back together. So I'm so glad you brought that up.
I was thinking of it also in terms of what we're doing here, which is deep remembering
Mm-hmm.
and putting ourselves in context in a different way. And it becomes alive for me in a different way because of everybody both looking at the same thing and reacting to it, how it is from where they sit.
I agree. It's not just remembering, but everybody's memories are assembling into a greater unit.
Yeah.
And
We've all-
sharing the different interpretations just deepens the whole
Yeah.
entity
Yeah.
that we're assembling.
Yeah.
And that is a reminder that the whole is in fact bigger than the sum of the parts, right? That it's something bigger, and our understanding is broadened and deepened. Question for you all, because we have talked about reading Job next, and before Fred left, we talked about maybe reading James first as a little segue, and then picking up with Job when he gets back, because I know he very much wants to do Job. How would you feel about doing that, or do you want to leap right into Job?
I think if Fred really wants to, I think you ought to start Job from the start, and I think this interval would be a good idea, sort of a intermission.
I'd like to go for James. I had, since we have a slot for it, met when we were at the seminary in South Africa, one of the professors, it was an import from Scotland, and absolutely unintelligible without a translator, but his study had been of James, and he deeply regarded it as just central to Christianity and his understanding of it. And I would love to get deeper into it and see what he was seeing.
In plain English.
Yes.
Great Scots.
Well, unless anyone objects, why don't we plan next week to start with James? And then, who knows how long that'll take us, the rate we go. But then we will do Job in earnest, because I think that that's really important, because we've been kicking Job around for a long time and talking that we wanted to study him together. So, all right, the next week we pick up with the Epistle to James.
Thank
And
you.
we finished Mark today.
Yay.
Yay! And thank you all so much for taking this journey together.
Well, thank you for guiding us,
Thank
Patty.
you.
Thank you.
It's
Thanks, everybody.
It's the
Yeah.
greatest
Yeah.
part of my week. That's why I told my husband, you go down to the gym, because I'm going to do Bible study here before we leave. And so I've banished him so that I could do Bible study, because I wouldn't want to have us miss this. It's
Get yourself a noon checkout.
exactly. It's what we did.
Mm.
All right,
Uh-huh.
my friends. I will see some
Okay.
of you on Sunday. Be well.
Bye.
God
Thank
bless.
you.
See you
Bye-bye.
soon.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye, everybody.